There is a number, 12 digits, glowing on a screen at 9:47 a.m. on a random Tuesday 1,000,000,000,000, $1 trillion. Nobody calls you. No bell rings, no champagne. An intern in another building refreshes a dashboard, sees the number, and goes back to making coffee, and you, the person this number technically belongs to, are sitting in a parked car outside a Target in Ohio, engine off, hands on the wheel, feeling absolutely nothing. This is the story of how that happens. Not the highlight reel. The real one. The one where the hunger that built the empire is the same hunger that won't let you feel it. Stay until the end, because the final 6 minutes are the part nobody tells you, the part about what's actually sitting in that driver's seat. Part 1, The Garage, Youngstown, Ohio. 2003. Your father has worked the same tire plant for 19 years. 2 herniated discs, 1 frozen shoulder, and a pension that gets restructured every time the company changes hands. He comes home smelling like rubber and grease, and the first thing he does, every single night, is check the mail before he takes off his boots, not because he's expecting anything good, because he's checking for what's bad before it can surprise him. Your mother clips coupons at the kitchen table with the focus of a surgeon. You watch her cut along the dotted line, and you understand, even at 10 years old, that this is not frugality. This is triage. You are not the kid people worry about. Your clothes fit. Your grades are fine. You're invisible in the way that quietly broke kids are invisible, because the system only notices the kids who are loud about it. Here's the part that matters. You don't get angry about any of this. You get curious. While other 10-year-olds are memorizing batting averages, you're sitting in the garage, taking apart a broken lawnmower engine just to see why it stopped working. And then you start asking the same question about everything else. Why does the tire plant keep almost closing, but never close? Why does the guy who owns 3 Applebee's locations drive a nicer truck than the regional manager who oversees 40 of them? Who actually keeps the money? And where does it go when it leaves your house? By 13, you've read every business biography in the Mahoning County Library System. Twice. Your father gets passed over for shift supervisor, a job he's been doing without the title for 2 years, because corporate flies someone in from Charlotte who's never set foot on the floor. He doesn't complain. He just comes home, eats dinner, and asks if there's more bread. You watch him reach for the bread basket, and something in your chest locks into place. You decide right there, 11 years old, elbows on a vinyl tablecloth. I am going to understand this machine well enough to own a piece of it. Retention beat. Part 2. The cold email. Most people think the break comes from a mentor who notices them. Yours comes from an email nobody answered. At 16, you find a regional logistics conference happening 40 minutes away. You can't afford the ticket, so you email all 19 speakers asking if you can sit in the lobby and just listen. 18 ignore you. One replies, a man named Russell Voss, mid-30s, runs a freight data analytics firm that most people in the room have never heard of, but every major carrier secretly depends on. He doesn't give you a ticket. He gives you a homework assignment, a spreadsheet. 3 years of regional fuel surcharge data, completely unlabeled, no context. Tell me what story this data is telling. You have until Sunday. You spend 40 hours on it. By Sunday, you've found something even Russell's own team missed. A 6-week lag pattern between diesel price spikes and contract renegotiations that nobody was pricing correctly. You send it back at 11:58 p.m. Sunday night. He calls you Monday morning, not to say good job, to say, can you do that again but for the Midwest grain corridor? For 2 years, you're his unofficial, unpaid analyst. You take the bus 90 minutes each way to his office, a converted print shop that smells like toner and ambition, and you sit next to a woman named Marisol, his head of operations, who teaches you something Russell never explicitly could. How to find the one constraint in a system that, if you fix it, makes every other problem smaller. You do this while finishing high school. Then, while going to Youngstown State on a partial scholarship, working nights, sleeping in shifts that would alarm a doctor. People romanticize this part. Don't. You are not grinding because you love it. You are running on a deficit you can feel in your teeth, and the only thing that makes the deficit quiet down, even for an hour, is progress. You file that feeling away. You'll need it later. You'll also pay for it later. Pot 3, the build. At 22, you see the gap Russell never had time to chase. Regional carriers are losing 15–20% of their margin because freight pricing is negotiated manually, contract by exhausted dispatchers using spreadsheets from 2009. You build a pricing engine that automates it, using the exact lag pattern you found at 16, except now it's the entire product. You build the first version alone, in 8 months, in an apartment with a mattress on the floor and a desk made from a door. Russell offers to fund it. $200,000 for 30%. You say no, not because you don't trust him, because you've run the math on what 30% becomes after 3 funding rounds, and you know that founders who give away too much too early don't lose their company all at once. They lose it one reasonable ask at a time, until the day they realize they're an employee of something with their name on the door. You raise $2.4 million instead from 4 investors for 16% combined. You spend 7 months making the product actually work before you charge anyone $1, which means by the time you set a price, you already know it's worth it. You price high. High price signals certainty, and certainty is the only thing nervous logistics executives actually buy. 18 months later, you have 90 employees. 3 years later, 600. Somewhere around employee 200, you stop being able to name everyone in the building. You tell yourself this is just what scale looks like. You don't examine the feeling underneath it. You're 25. You don't have time to examine feelings yet. You have a board meeting in 11 minutes. The first exit. The acquisition offer comes from a company most people have heard of. $4.1 billion. You're 27. The wire clears on a Thursday afternoon. You're in a glass conference room when your phone buzzes with the confirmation. You look at it for maybe 8 seconds. Then you set the phone face down on the table and go back to the meeting that's already started, because apparently that's just what you do now. That night, alone, you wait for the feeling. The arrival. The exhale you've been promising yourself since you were 11 years old at that vinyl tablecloth. It doesn't come. What comes instead is a low, steady hum, like a refrigerator running in another room. You can hear it if you stop and listen for it. Otherwise, it just sits underneath everything all the time, never louder, never quieter. Psychologists have a name for this. It's called the arrival fallacy, the deeply held, almost universal belief that reaching a major goal will produce a lasting state of fulfillment, when in reality, the emotional spike is brief and the baseline returns almost immediately. Tal Ben-Shahar coined the term after noticing it in his most successful Harvard students. People who'd hit every marker of achievement and felt, within days, exactly like they did before. You don't know the term yet. You just know the hum doesn't go away. Retention beat. If you've ever achieved a goal and felt less than you expected, keep watching. This is the part where it gets worse before it gets worth understanding. Part 4. The second bet. You buy your parents a house outside Youngstown. Your father walks every room twice, runs his hand along the new countertops, and says almost nothing. Your mother stands in the kitchen and cries in a way she's clearly been holding in for 30 years. This is the only moment in the entire transaction that feels like anything. Everything else. The lawyers, the security consultations, the PR person who now reviews your texts before you send them to old friends, feels like administration. You start checking exits in restaurants without deciding to. You stop being able to tell if people like you or like what you represent, and eventually you stop asking the question because the answer doesn't change your behavior either way. 6 months after the acquisition closes, you do something almost nobody expects. You start over. Not because you need the money. You'll never need money again, mathematically, even accounting for inflation, divorce, and bad decisions. You start over because the hum gets quieter when you're building something, and you've started organizing your life around managing the hum. The second company is in a sector most of your old logistics contacts think is unrelated. Industrial AI infrastructure, the unglamorous, capital-intensive layer that sits underneath the flashy AI products everyone talks about. You take a 19% founder stake. You tell yourself this one is just interesting. You know, somewhere underneath that sentence, that it's also enormous if it works. It works. Pot 5. The number. 7 years later, you're 34. The company you co-founded has become one of the 4 or 5 companies that the entire AI economy quietly runs through. The picks and shovels business nobody puts on a t-shirt. Its valuation crosses $5 trillion on a Tuesday in March, and your 19% stake, diluted down to about 12% after 7 years of funding rounds, crosses $1 trillion on a screen that updates in real time, the same screen the intern checks before getting coffee. You are sitting in a parked car outside a Target. You'd gone in for paper towels and a phone charger. Your phone buzzes, not with a call, just a portfolio notification, the same kind of notification you've ignored 400 times this year, and you glance at it before starting the engine. 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, you sit there. Engine off. Paper towels in the passenger seat, and you feel the hum. Same hum. Exact same pitch as the day the first wire cleared, 11 years and 3 orders of magnitude ago. This is the part that should be impossible, and isn't. The feeling does not scale with the number. It never did. It was never about the number. The number was always just the scoreboard for something else. Something that started at a vinyl tablecloth in Youngstown and has been running, unexamined, ever since. Part 6. The sister. You fly home for your niece's birthday. Your sister, a high school guidance counselor, married, 2 kids, a 2016 Honda with 140,000 miles on it, picks you up from the airport. On the drive, she puts on a playlist from when you were both teenagers. She sings along badly, completely without self-consciousness, the way you sing when you're certain no one is evaluating you. You realize, sitting in the passenger seat of a 14-year-old Honda, worth more on paper than entire countries, that you cannot remember the last time you did anything, said anything, ordered anything, laughed at anything, without some small background process calculating how it would read to someone else. Your sister is singing badly to a song from 2011. You don't sing along, not because you don't know the words, because some part of you is still running the calculation on whether singing along is on brand. And by the time that part of you finishes running, the song is already over. That's the part that stays with you on the flight home, not the trillion. The song, Pot 7, the wound, is the engine. A concept in psychology. Researchers studying high achievers sometimes call it the founder's wound, an early formative experience of scarcity, instability, or powerlessness that gets converted into relentless drive. The wound doesn't heal when the external problem gets solved, because the wound was never really about the external problem. It's a pattern laid down early, running on autopilot, completely indifferent to your bank balance. The thing is, and this is the part almost nobody says out loud, closing the wound would mean stopping. And stopping is the one thing the pattern was built to prevent. You gave your father a paid-off house, a pension nobody can touch, and the ability to say no to anything for the rest of his life. He is, genuinely, without complication, content. He sits on his porch. He doesn't check exits. He doesn't run calculations before he speaks. You solved his problem completely. You did not solve yours, because yours was never about the money. It just used the money as a proxy for 34 years, and the proxy got so large that the gap between the proxy and the real thing became impossible to ignore. You are 34 years old, sitting in a parked car outside a Target, a $1 trillion number on your phone, paper towels in the passenger seat, and a low hum underneath all of it that has not changed in 11 years. You start the engine. You drive home. Tomorrow there's a board meeting. You already know you're not going to stop. Not because you don't see it clearly. You see it more clearly than almost anyone ever will. You're not going to stop because the seeing isn't the same as the healing, and nobody ever told you those were 2 different jobs. Somewhere in Youngstown right now, there's an 11-year-old at a vinyl tablecloth, watching a parent reach for the breadbasket, filing a feeling away for later. He doesn't know yet that later is going to be the entire rest of his life. If you've ever hit a goal, any goal, not $1 trillion, just your version of it, and felt that hum instead of the relief you expected, that's the real story here. Tell me in the comments what your kitchen table moment was. Where did your hunger actually start?